There's a structural problem with genocide, which is that it tends to happen in places that are off the beaten path.
So now, in order to promote nonviolence and reduce violence, ultimately we have to address the motivation.
Society needs to acknowledge that learning is a lifelong challenge.
The sit-ins challenge cherished beliefs most whites held dearly.
At the DNA level, we're all 99.9% the same. All of us.
So individuals do matter. And I think the quality of our individual leadership matters.
Who is speaking for poor people? 40 million Americans make $6 an hour. Who is speaking for them?
The only thing that one has after throwing everything overboard is the love that one can give.
I'm happy to be here because it's both an honor and an obligation. It's an honor to be associated with what you're trying to do. It's an obligation in the sense that those of us who claim that we want to advance human understanding and racial harmony and issues of justice, we have an obligation to serve. So in many ways, I'm here today to try to be of service, or in the spirit of service, so that in effect, coming out of this interaction, we may find some common cause that would allow us to advance those values upon which this university is built, and those values that we probably incorporate in our personal lives. I'm happy to be here to be able to speak about Ralph Bunche. I was born in Chicago, 1942. So coming out of Chicago as a young Negro boy, the question was, well, what are you going to do when you grow up? Well, if you were good in athletics, be Jackie Robinson. I was not good in athletics. If you're good in math and science, be the Black Apollo, Dr. Ernest Just. I was not so good in math and science. I was left with, well, be like Dr. Bunche. And what is ironic is that if you look at my curriculum vitae, if you look at my life experiences, I really have been prepared to understand the message of Dr. Bunche. And in some small respect, being here and talking about Ralph Bunche and his legacy is an opportunity for me to answer those matriarchal voices in my family who said, make us proud, and I can now say, well, I'm doing the work of Dr. Bunche. I should also mention that Dr. Bunche was a very active board member of Phelps Stokes for over 20 years. And he was very, very adroit in using Phelps Stokes as a vehicle to accomplish certain objectives that he couldn't accomplish as Undersecretary of the United Nations. And much of my work today is in the shadow of the work of Dr. Ralph Bunche. So to be able to come and talk about him is both a honor and indeed an obligation. And the last reason that I'm happy to be here is to figure out what do we do about successor generations. And I do believe that the best of what Thomas Jefferson stood for, the best of what Ralph Bunche stood for, the best of what the University of Virginia stands for, and the best of what Phelps Stokes claims it to be, that somehow or another we can find ways of sharing those values and that knowledge so that the overall result is that successor generations, in fact, can move forward. The relay race for justice and humanity is a relay race. Relay races are won and lost in the exchange zones. If we do not figure out a way to more effectively exchange not only the knowledge, not only the values, but the demonstration, the application of those values, if we don't do that to the next generation, then surely we have done a disservice to ourselves and a disservice to the very sort of organizations and writings that we, in fact, publicly commit ourselves to. The title of my talk is a daunting one, Legacies for Successor Generations, Thomas Jefferson and Ralph Bunche. Now, that calls for a conceptual leap. in the popular minds. How on earth are you going to connect Thomas Jefferson to Ralph Bunche other than maybe Sally Hemings or whatever? Well, the truth of the matter is that, as I point out, Jefferson was a complex person. On the one hand, certainly having beliefs about the inferiority of some people, but yet at the same time wanting to abolish a peculiar institution that really denigrated the very notion of humanity. In any case, the legacy of Jefferson certainly is captured in the architecture of this campus, the principles of change, of invention, of education that just permeates the wonderful things that have been done here by himself and in his name. Well, one of the things that caught my attention as I Googled Jefferson and the University of Virginia was a quote, and he says, "The march of events has not been such as to render its completion practicable within the limits of time allotted to me. And I leave its accomplishment as the work of another generation. The abolition of evil is not impossible. It ought never, therefore, to be despaired of. Every plan should be adopted, every experiment tried, which may do something towards the ultimate object." And of course, when I read that quote, I immediately interpreted, reinterpreted, and defined it as his legacy that would fit my talk. And so therefore, I really understood that as he talked about the ultimate objects, I knew he meant full education and participation in a global community that we are in. Similarly, that the work of another generation would be the Ralph Bunche Societies at the University of Virginia. And that all would be done in the service of the abolition of evil, and evil in the form of racism, blocked access, and inequality. Jefferson argues for an academical village, which is physically embodied here in the lawn and the ranges and the marvelous landscaping of this campus. But I think the notion was that in that academical village, one would acquire certain habits of reflection, certain habits of action that, in fact, would cause one to rise above the narrow confines of our individualistic concerns in order to embrace a broader concern for all humanity. That academical village would encourage people to achieve excellence in all fields. And the values of that village certainly would prepare people to understand that they need to enter the new age with more understanding and more goodwill. Now, what is interesting about this day and age, and Tom Friedman in his book, The World is Flat, sort of really makes this point, is that through the genius of science and technology, we have shrunk the world. And so therefore, the consequences of our actions, whether they be intended or unintended, often are global. So the reality is that we are increasingly living in a physical neighborhood where, whether it be climate or other actions or the environment, it has consequences for us all. While we may live in a neighborhood, we have yet to create a notion of brotherhood. And the point is that if we are increasingly dependent on each other and impacted on by our choices, then how is it that we build a consensus of how we should live together in this small, confined neighborhood? If, in fact, we do not come up with better standards of behavior rooted in the finest legacies, if we don't do that, then, in fact, the opportunity of creating a new world